In 2025, a team of geneticists published results that quietly reshaped one of South Asia's oldest and most emotionally charged questions. For generations, Tamil identity across India and Sri Lanka has been defined largely through language, culture, and a shared literary tradition stretching back more than 2,000 years, anchored in classical Tamil Sangam literature, and a continuous linguistic heritage that Tamil speakers on both sides of the strait have long pointed to as evidence of a single, enduring, cultural nation spanning the water between them. But nobody had systematically compared the actual DNA of Tamil populations living on both sides of the Palk Strait, the narrow stretch of water separating Tamil Nadu from northern Sri Lanka, against the full genetic landscape of the island and the wider South Asian mainland. When researchers finally ran that comparison using modern whole genome sequencing, the results did not simply confirm what everyone already assumed. They revealed a far more layered, occasionally surprising picture of ancestry, migration, and connection that cuts directly across some of the region's most deeply held cultural and political narratives. To understand why this study mattered so much, it helps to understand the two competing frameworks scholars have used for decades to explain South Asian ancestry in the first place. The dominant model in modern population genetics divides deep South Asian ancestry into two primary components. The first is often called ancestral South Indian ancestry, sometimes labeled ASI, or, in more recent and refined studies, AASI for ancient ancestral South Indian, representing a deeply rooted indigenous population that inhabited the subcontinent for tens of thousands of years before any major outside migration arrived. The second is ancestral North Indian ancestry, ANI, which carries a substantial genetic contribution from steppe pastoralist populations that migrated into South Asia several thousand years ago, generally associated with the arrival of Indo-European languages across the northern and central parts of the subcontinent. Nearly every population living in South Asia today carries some blend of these two ancestral components, but the exact ratio varies enormously depending on region, caste, and linguistic group. And that variation turns out to be the single most important thread running through the entire Tamil genetic story. Tamil-speaking populations across Tamil Nadu consistently show some of the highest concentrations of AASI ancestry found anywhere in South Asia, frequently in the range of 65 to 75%, alongside a smaller but still meaningful component of ancestry linked to ancient Iranian farming populations that arrived in the subcontinent even earlier, and comparatively little of the steppe-derived ancestry that dominates further north. This pattern holds true with remarkable consistency across the vast majority of Tamil caste and community groups studied, distinguishing Tamil populations from many North Indian groups where steppe ancestry runs considerably higher, sometimes reaching well above 30 or 40% in certain northern populations, compared to the single-digit or low double-digit figures more typical of Tamil Nadu communities. That does not mean Tamil populations are ancestrally uniform, however, and this is where the genetic picture starts, getting genuinely interesting rather than simply confirming a single clean narrative, precisely the kind of nuance that gets lost whenever population genetics gets flattened into a simple headline. Detailed studies of Tamil Nadu's caste populations have found measurable, sometimes substantial differences in steppe-related ancestry between different community groups within Tamil Nadu itself, with certain upper caste Tamil groups showing modestly higher proportions of that northern-linked ancestry, compared to other Tamil communities, reflecting complex, layered migration and social history within the region, rather than a single, unbroken genetic line stretching back unchanged for millennia. Now across the Palk Strait into Sri Lanka, and the story becomes considerably more complicated and considerably more fascinating. A landmark 2025 whole genome study examined DNA from Sri Lanka's major ethnic communities, including Sinhalese, Sri Lankan Tamils, and several distinct Adivasi clans representing some of the island's earliest documented inhabitants. Researchers found that Sri Lankan Tamils, Sinhalese, and Adivasi groups all show genetic profiles broadly resembling South Indian Dravidian-speaking populations, with the study's authors noting there was no significant genetic input from outside South Asia detectable in the broader Sri Lankan gene pool. That alone was a meaningful finding, confirming that despite Sri Lanka's geographic isolation as an island and its long, complicated history of external contact through trade and colonization, the deep ancestral roots of its population trace back overwhelmingly to South Asia itself rather than any outside source. But the most striking finding involved the genetic relationship between Sri Lanka's two largest ethnic communities, the Sinhalese, who speak an Indo-Aryan language and form the island's majority population, and Sri Lankan Tamils, who speak a Dravidian language closely related to the Tamil spoken across the strait in Tamil Nadu. Despite speaking languages from two entirely different language families, Indo-Aryan and Dravidian respectively, families that diverged from each other so many thousands of years ago that native speakers of one cannot understand a single word of the other, Without formal study, genetic studies have consistently found that Sinhalese and Sri Lankan Tamil populations share a substantial proportion of ancestry with each other, in some analyses considerably more than either group shares with populations from other parts of South Asia entirely disconnected from the island. Some earlier genetic surveys estimated Sri Lankan Tamils carry roughly 55% ancestry overlapping specifically with the Sinhalese population, while Sinhalese in turn show a substantial proportion of ancestry tracing back to South Indian Tamil populations, a genuinely striking pattern given how sharply Sinhalese and Tamil identity have been politically and culturally distinguished from each other, particularly across the difficult decades of ethnic conflict the island endured in the 20th and early 21st centuries. It is worth pausing on how researchers actually measure something as abstract as ancestral population proportions, because the methodology is what gives these findings their scientific weight, rather than leaving them as vague cultural speculation. Modern population geneticists compare whole genome data from living populations against reference panels built from ancient DNA recovered at archaeological sites across South Asia and the broader region, along with statistical models that estimate the most likely mixture of ancestral source populations needed to explain the genetic pattern observed in any given modern group. This approach, refined significantly over the past decade through large international collaborations involving institutions in India, Sri Lanka, Europe, and the United States, allows researchers to move well beyond older techniques that relied on a handful of individual genetic markers, instead analyzing hundreds of thousands or even millions of genetic variants simultaneously across the entire genome. That scale of analysis is precisely what allows scientists to detect the kind of subtle, layered ancestry patterns distinguishing Sri Lankan Tamils from mainland Tamil Nadu populations, or estate Tamil communities from the island's older Tamil population, distinctions far too fine-grained for earlier genetic techniques to have reliably captured. The 2025 study on Sri Lankan ancestry specifically stands out within this broader research landscape because of how carefully the research team approached community engagement before collecting any genetic samples at all. Rather than simply gathering DNA and publishing results afterward, researchers prioritized direct engagement with the specific communities being studied from the very beginning of the project, a deliberate methodological choice reflecting lessons learned from decades of population genetics research in which indigenous and minority communities worldwide were sometimes studied without adequate consent, context, or benefit sharing, leaving lasting mistrust between genetics researchers and the very populations whose DNA made their findings possible. That kind of careful, consent-centered approach matters enormously in a region like Sri Lanka, where questions of ancestry and indigeneity carry direct political weight, and where a poorly handled research process could easily be perceived as taking sides in an already sensitive ethnic and political history rather than contributing neutral, carefully caveated scientific understanding. If deep, evidence-based breakdowns like this are exactly what you want more of on this channel, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe right now, because it genuinely helps more people find coverage grounded in real research instead of the surface-level content covering this same region everywhere else. What this genetic overlap suggests, according to the researchers studying it, is not that Sinhalese and Tamil identity in Sri Lanka were somehow artificially invented or culturally meaningless, a conclusion that would badly misread what the science actually shows. Rather, it points towards something more historically specific, a shared deep ancestral population on the island that existed before the current linguistic and cultural divisions fully crystallized, followed by a process in which different communities adopted different languages, religious traditions, and cultural identities over many centuries, likely shaped by waves of migration, trade contact, and religious change arriving from both South India and further afield, layered on top of that shared genetic substrate rather than replacing it wholesale. In other words, the genetic evidence suggests language and ethnic identity in Sri Lanka may have shifted and diverged over time on top of a population that remained, at the biological level, considerably more interconnected than centuries of separate cultural and political identity might suggest. That finding carries obvious weight given Sri Lanka's modern history. The island endured a brutal, decades-long civil conflict between the Sinhalese majority government and Tamil separatist forces, a conflict rooted partly in competing narratives about ancestral belonging, indigeneity, and which community held deeper historical claims to the island. Genetics cannot settle questions of political legitimacy, cultural identity, or historical grievance, and researchers involved in this kind of population study are consistently careful to say so directly, emphasizing that shared ancestry is a finding about biological population history, not a tool for resolving contested political or territorial claims. But the genetic data does offer a striking counterpoint to any narrative, framing Sinhalese and Tamil communities as originating from entirely separate, unrelated ancestral populations with no meaningful shared biological history on the island. The evidence instead points toward a much more intertwined, layered history of coexistence, intermarriage, and gradual cultural divergence stretching back well over 2,000 years. The Vedda, or Adivasi, communities of Sri Lanka add yet another important piece to this puzzle, and their genetic story helps explain a great deal about how the island's population history actually unfolded over time. Long treated in both popular and some academic accounts as Sri Lanka's most ancient, most isolated indigenous inhabitants, genetic testing has confirmed the Vedda Do carry a genuinely distinct ancestral signature, setting them apart from Sinhalese and Tamil populations. But the same 2025 study found their genetic profile still resembles the broader South Indian Dravidian-speaking ancestral cluster far more closely than any completely separate, isolated lineage unrelated to the mainland. Researchers interpreted this as evidence that the ancestors of the Vedda likely intermixed with migrants arriving from mainland India relatively early in the island's settlement history, a finding that lines up closely with long-standing archaeological and linguistic theories, placing the Vedda as descendants of South Asia's earliest documented inhabitants, with subsequent waves of Tamil and Sinhalese migration arriving afterward and gradually reshaping the island's linguistic and cultural landscape without fully displacing that older genetic substrate. That layered settlement pattern helps make sense of one of the most genuinely counterintuitive findings in this entire body of research. The fact that Sinhalese, an Indo-Aryan language entirely unrelated to Tamil at the linguistic level, is spoken by a population whose genome resembles Dravidian-speaking South Indians far more than it resembles other Indo-Aryan-speaking populations from North India, the region where Indo-Aryan languages actually originated. Historical. Linguists have long proposed that Sinhalese arrived in Sri Lanka through a relatively small founding migration, traditionally associated in local legend with the semi-mythical Prince Vijaya, whose followers are said to have introduced an early Indo-Aryan language to the island. Genetic evidence now strongly supports a version of that broad narrative, showing that comparatively small founding population, introducing a new language over time, became demographically absorbed into and genetically blended with a much larger existing South Asian descended population already present on the island, producing today's Sinhalese community, a group whose language traces to the north, but whose genome traces overwhelmingly to the south. This kind of pattern, where language spreads and shifts across a population without a corresponding wholesale genetic replacement, is increasingly well documented across world history, and Sri Lanka now stands as one of the clearer, more thoroughly studied examples of exactly that process happening within a relatively contained island setting. Understanding this layered history also helps clarify why the genetic closeness between Sinhalese and Sri Lankan Tamil populations should not be misread as evidence that the two communities are, or ever were, identical or interchangeable. Shared deep ancestry coexists comfortably alongside centuries of real, meaningful cultural, linguistic, and religious divergence. Sinhalese communities developed a distinct Buddhist religious and literary tradition intertwined closely with their adopted Indo-Aryan language, while Tamil communities on the island maintained strong religious, literary, and cultural continuity with Hindu and Dravidian traditions on the mainland, reinforced by ongoing contact across the narrow Palk Strait throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Genetics measures biological population history. It does not measure, and was never designed to measure, the depth, validity, or importance of the cultural, religious, and linguistic identities that Sinhalese and Tamil communities built and maintained across more than 2,000 years of separate historical experience on the island, identities that remain fully legitimate and meaningful regardless of what a genome comparison happens to reveal about deep shared ancestry. And while both groups share the same broad Dravidian genetic signature, high AASI ancestry, moderate ancestry linked to ancient Iranian farming populations, and comparatively low steppe-derived ancestry, researchers have identified subtle but measurable genetic distinctions between Sri Lankan Tamils and mainland Tamil Nadu populations. These differences appear to reflect founder effects, meaning Sri Lankan Tamil communities descend from a relatively limited founding population, whose genetic signature became concentrated and somewhat distinct through generations of relative isolation on the island, combined with genetic drift, the gradual random shifting of allele frequencies that naturally occurs within any population over enough generations, and comparatively limited ongoing gene flow back and forth across the Palk Strait, once distinct island, and mainland communities became established. None of this contradicts the deep shared ancestry between the two Tamil populations. It simply reflects the ordinary genetic consequences of a population splitting geographically and then living apart, with limited but real ongoing contact, across roughly 2,000 years of separate island and mainland history. There is also a distinct, more recent chapter to Sri Lanka's Tamil genetic story that researchers are careful to treat separately from the island's ancient Tamil population. During the 19th century, British colonial administrators brought large numbers of Tamil laborers from specific regions of southern Tamil Nadu to work on Sri Lanka's tea and coffee plantations, a community today generally referred to as Sri Lankan Tamils of recent Indian origin, or sometimes historically as estate Tamils, to distinguish them from Sri Lanka's older indigenous Tamil population, whose presence on the island predates colonial rule by well over 1,000 years. Genetic studies show estate Tamil communities carry a genetic profile closely matching the specific southern Tamil Nadu districts from which their ancestors were recruited, often traceable to particular districts like Madurai, Tirunelveli, and surrounding regions of the old Madras Presidency, a genetically distinct and much more recent migration layered on top of the island's much older pre-colonial Tamil population, illustrating just how many separate historical chapters can sit stacked on top of each other within a single modern ethnic label. There is also a broader South Asian context worth placing this Tamil-specific research within, because the patterns showing up across Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka are not entirely unique to Dravidian-speaking populations. Similar layered ancestry stories, deep indigenous genetic substrates persisting underneath later linguistic and cultural shifts, have emerged from genetic studies of other South Asian regions as well, from the tribal populations of central India to caste groups across the Gangetic Plain in the north. What makes the Tamil and Sri Lankan case particularly well documented and particularly significant for public understanding is the sheer density of independent genetic studies now available covering this specific region, spanning research from Indian, Sri Lankan, and international institutions over nearly 2 decades, using progressively more sophisticated genomic techniques each time. That accumulated body of evidence gives researchers unusual confidence in the broad outlines of the story, even as specific details, exact ancestry percentages, precise migration timelines, and finer-grained community-level distinctions continue to be refined with each new study. The caste dimension of Tamil genetic history deserves particular attention as well, because it complicates any simple narrative treating Tamil identity as a single, genetically uniform category. Research examining caste populations, specifically within Tamil Nadu, has consistently found meaningful genetic differentiation between different Tamil caste communities, reflecting centuries of endogamous marriage practices that kept many caste groups genetically distinct from their neighbors, even while sharing the same broad regional Dravidian ancestry, language, and geographic territory. Some studies analyzing groups like the Iyur and Iyengar, Brahmin communities of Tamil Nadu, have found these particular groups showing somewhat closer genetic affinity to upper caste populations from other regions of India, including parts of North India, than to certain other Tamil-speaking communities within Tamil Nadu itself, a pattern researchers attribute to caste-based marriage practices operating as a genuinely powerful, long-term force shaping genetic structure independently of shared regional language and geography. This finding illustrates something important about how ancestry actually works at a fine-grained level across South Asia more broadly, where social structures like caste have historically functioned as a form of genetic isolation nearly as consequential as geographic distance itself, sometimes producing greater genetic differentiation between neighboring caste communities than between geographically distant populations sharing similar caste status. None of this research claims to have settled every open question about South Asian population history, and researchers publishing these studies have specifically called for expanded whole genome sequencing across a much wider range of India's tribal and Dravidian-speaking communities, arguing that a fuller regional dataset would help reconstruct South Asia's demographic history with far greater precision than currently available. Several research teams have specifically flagged Sri Lanka's Adivasi communities and various lesser-studied Tamil Nadu caste and tribal groups as priorities for future sequencing efforts, noting that the current picture, while far more detailed than anything available even a decade ago, still rests on comparatively limited sample sizes for some of the region's smaller and more geographically isolated communities. It is also worth being direct about the limits of what any of this evidence can responsibly claim to prove, particularly given how easily population genetics research gets misused or oversimplified once it leaves academic journals and enters public and non-political discourse, where nuance tends to get stripped away in favor of whichever simplified conclusion best fits an existing narrative. Shared ancestry between Sinhalese and Tamil communities does not settle questions about land, governance, or political rights on the island, and researchers involved in this work have been explicit that their findings should not be weaponized by any side of Sri Lanka's long and painful ethnic history to claim superior indigeneity or greater ancestral legitimacy over the other. Genetic ancestry data describes biological population history operating on a timescale of centuries and millennia. It says nothing directly about the political, economic, and social grievances that shape the island's modern conflict, grievances rooted in far more recent colonial Era, policy, language rights, economic opportunity, and political representation, rather than in questions of who arrived on the island first in some deep genetic sense. Tamil populations across Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka share deep, measurable common ancestry stretching back thousands of years, distinguished by subtle regional variation shaped by geography, migration timing, and centuries of relative isolation, while simultaneously sharing substantial ancestry with neighboring Sinhalese communities whose language and cultural identity diverged from Tamil identity long ago, on top of a genetic foundation both communities still carry today. 2,000 years of shifting languages, religions, kingdoms, and political boundaries clearly reshaped how people identified themselves and their neighbors, and those identities remain fully real and fully theirs to define. What the DNA shows is that underneath all of that layered cultural history, the biological threads connecting these communities to each other and to the deep indigenous ancestry of the wider South Asian subcontinent never actually broke.